By the early 1990s, Sierra Leone was a nation on the edge. The economy had collapsed, public trust had disappeared, and daily life had become a struggle. Rising prices, corruption, and frustration created a sense of hopelessness. Many people whispered that unless something dramatic happened, the country would break apart. It was a dangerous prophecy. But then came in March of 1991, the country entered into one of Africa's bloodiest and most brutal civil wars, when rebel fighters of the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, under the leadership of former Army Corporal Foday Sankoh, with help from Liberian warlord Charles Taylor and his group, the National Patriotic Front of Liberia, the NPFL, launched an insurrection in an attempt to overthrow the government of Sierra Leonean President Joseph Saidu Momo. As the fighting spread through the eastern and southern parts of the country, the burden fell on young soldiers. They were sent to the front line in 1991 with poor equipment, limited ammunition, and months of unpaid salaries. On April 29, 1992, a group of young officers left the battlefronts and entered the capital and toppled the government of President Joseph Saidu Momo. The reason they gave for entering the capital was to protest over the shortage of rations and to demand the payment of their salaries, which had been in arrears for a long time. But they only used this as a pretext for entering the capital. Their real motive, as it turned out, was to overthrow the government of President Joseph Saidu Momo and assume political power. In this episode, we cover the true story behind the 1992 Sierra Leonean coup d'etat. In other words, we look at when, how, and where the coup plot was planned and how it was carried out. However, to fully understand the root cause of this coup d'etat, we need to go all the way back to the very beginning. Sierra Leone, a former British colony, achieved its independence from Britain on April 27, 1961, with Sir Milton Margai of the Sierra Leone People's Party, the SLPP, which was founded in 1951 as its first prime minister, and upon his death in 1964, he was succeeded by his younger brother, Sir Albert Margai, as the country's second prime minister. In 1967, opposition leader Siaka Stevens of the All People's Congress Party, the APC, which was founded in 1960, won the 1967 Sierra Leonean general election, but was deposed in a military coup after only few hours of his swearing in as the country's third prime minister. After a brief period of military rule, he was restored to power following a counter-military coup in April 1968. Hence, he became the country's third prime minister. In 1971, Siaka Stevens transformed the country into a presidential republic with himself as the first executive president. And in 1978, he declared the country a one-party state with the APC to be the sole legally recognized party. All other political parties were banned, including the main opposition, the SLPP. After ruling the country for 17 years, Siaka Stevens stepped down in 1985 and handed over power to Major General Joseph Saidu Momo, the army commander and the highest-ranking officer in the army. Momo inherited a disintegrating economy from his predecessor, and he was unable to stop the trend. He also inherited a system that was rife with corruption and the instability which corruption led to. As the decade of the 1980s drew to a close, a country that at its independence was ranked ahead of the Asian tigers of Malaysia and Singapore on almost every socio-economic index found itself slipping below the level of even a failed state. By 1991, Sierra Leone was ranked as one of the poorest countries in the world, even though it benefited from ample natural resources including diamonds, gold, bauxite, rutile, iron ore, fish, coffee, and cocoa. In fact, much of the country's natural resources were smuggled out of the country with the aid and connivance of certain government officials and certain influential Afro-Lebanese businessmen. In 1989, a rebellion began in neighboring Liberia. In response to the conflict in Liberia, the West Africa Regional Bloc, known as the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, sent a peacekeeping force in 1990 to stabilize the country using Lungi Airport in Sierra Leone as backup base. The force was named ECOMOG, an acronym for Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group. The majority of the ECOMOG troops were Nigerian, with smaller contingents from Sierra Leone, Guinea, Gambia, and Ghana. In March of 1991, a rebellion with the aim of overthrowing the Sierra Leonean government erupted in the eastern part of the country. The rebellion was spearheaded by a rebel group called the Revolutionary United Front, the RUF, which was led by a former army corporal, Fode Sanko, who had been dismissed from the army and imprisoned for 7 years in the 1970s for taking part in an attempted coup against the Siaka Stevens government. He claimed that the RUF was fighting to end government corruption and inequality, promising to liberate the people of Sierra Leone from poverty and injustice. He also claimed they were fighting to dismantle the APC one-party rule and restore multi-party democracy. However, their actions quickly revealed a very different reality. Instead of offering hope or reform, the RUF spread fear and destruction. Their tactics were some of the most brutal seen in modern warfare, and they quickly gained international notoriety for their systematic use of terror against civilians. President Momo and his military chief, Major General Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, did not know from where to start when the rebel war broke out, as the army was bereaved of everything, apart from obsolete armored vehicles and defective AK-47 rifles to face the advancing rebels. Since the military was ill-equipped, President Momo therefore sent his military chief, Major General Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, to Europe in order to purchase arms and ammunition. As a result of the war in Sierra Leone, the Sierra Leone contingent that was part of the ECOMOG peacekeeping force in Liberia was called back by the Sierra Leonean government to repel the rebels in Sierra Leone. They were called back to put a halt to the RUF rapid advance on the Moa Barracks, the eastern military barracks in the country, which the rebels wanted at all costs to be used as their military base. In the struggle of preventing the fall of Moa Barracks into the hands of the rebels, the Sierra Leone army suffered many casualties, as a number of officers, men and women lost their lives. And in the struggle of preventing Moa Barracks from falling into the hands of the rebels, some officers and soldiers became wounded in action, including a young army captain, Captain Valentine Strasser, who sustained very serious injuries, and he was taken to the 34 military hospital in Freetown for treatment, and later redeployed as paymaster at the Teco Barracks in the northern provincial headquarter town of Makeni, where there was less combat activity at the time. In the end, the soldiers were able to prevent Moa Barracks from falling into the hands of the rebels. In order to pursue the war and defeat the rebels, the military headquarters in Freetown decided to form different units, such as Gladio Battalion, Viper Battalion, and Cobra Battalion. Within a short period of time, the Gladio Battalion was dislodged by the RUF, and many personnel of the Gladio Battalion became killed in action, missing in action, and wounded in action. As a result, the military headquarters in Freetown decided to merge both the Gladio Battalion and the Viper Battalion into one unit, and the unit was named Tiger Battalion, and it was stationed in the Moa Barracks in the eastern provincial town of Daru in the Kailahun district under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Obis Yamba Toure. The different battalions were composed of very young and brave officers. The Tiger Battalion had platoon commanders such as Captain Prince Ben Hirsch, Lieutenant Solomon Anthony James Musa, popularly known as Saj Musa, Lieutenant Julius Madabio, Lieutenant Komba Kambo, Lieutenant Charles Bayo, Second Lieutenant Kambo Monde, Second Lieutenant Idris Kamara, amongst others. On the other hand, the Cobra Battalion was stationed in the eastern provincial town of Kenema, in the Kenema district, and was first under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu, who was a seasoned fighter and was very popular among his officers and men. Later, the Cobra Battalion came under the command of Major Samuel Kanu. The Cobra Battalion had officers such as Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi and Second Lieutenant Tom Nyoma, amongst others. With such young, strong, and brave soldiers in the battlefields, the initial rebellion could have easily been quelled in the first half of 1991, but the war took its toll because of the government's ineffective response to the rebellion. The weaponry sent to the men in the battlefronts were unfit for the rebels. The soldiers were using Second World War-era weapons and ammunition, which were regularly jammed at crucial times. Some of the weapons and communications equipment were not workable. As stated earlier, prior to the war, the army was ill-equipped and poorly trained. The fear of a coup from the army had induced the government to keep the army relatively weak and ill-equipped, instead investing heavily on a paramilitary body that was first known as the Internal Security Unit, the ISU, to protect the government. The ISU later came to be known as the Special Security Division, the SSD, and it is now known as the Operation Support Division, the OSD. When the war began, since the army was ill-equipped, It sometimes therefore had to turn to the SSD for weapons to conduct its counterinsurgencies. In fact, the government was denying the soldiers the lethal weapons they needed to fight the rebels. The view was that the government feared that such weapons in the hands of the wrong soldiers might be used against it. And the government's fear was not without basis, as subsequent events would demonstrate. Thus, the government and its military leaders started a process of selective arming by arming their loyal soldiers. In fact, this policy was so egregious that, for instance, when the government in the early period of the war bought new AK-47s and rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, to match those being used by the RUF rebels, the government gave such weapons to the soldiers stationed in Freetown who were protecting the government and to a very select group of loyal soldiers at the war zones. Morale among those fighting the war was palpably low. The resources they needed to fight the war were at times non-existent. In the meantime, the rebels were able to seize the diamond mining areas in the eastern and southern parts of the country. The funds from alluvial diamonds mines were used to purchase weapons and ammunition from soldiers in neighboring Liberia, Libya, and occasionally even South Lebanon in order to supply the RUF rebels with ammunition. Within 1 year of fighting, the RUF rebellion had stalled, but it remained in control of large territories in the eastern and southern parts of the country, leaving many villages unprotected while also disrupting food and government diamond production. As a result, the Momo government lost all remaining credibility. Meanwhile, the soldiers in the front frequently ran out of essential military equipment. The soldiers always had to ask the government for supplies to support them on the front lines of the conflict against the RUF. Additionally, the soldiers' money was never delivered on time. The government was constantly discredited for not meeting the increasing logistics requirements of the fighting forces. They started to have doubts that they were being set up to die. In fact, there was the undisputed view among many of the soldiers who were fighting the war, and the general population at large, that President Momo was not committed in prosecuting the war. At the same time, pressure on Momo to liberalize the political system from both home and abroad was intense. As a result, he took a major constitutional reforms by terminating the one-party rule and returning the country to multi-party democracy in 1991. And multi-party elections were scheduled for the end of 1992. This was a watershed moment for Sierra Leone as Sierra Leoneans looked forward to the practice of democracy again with all that entails. A number of Momo's ministers deserted from the APC and some formed their own political party. However, there were great suspicions that President Momo was not serious about bringing political reforms, as most people weren't sure whether the government would conduct free and fair democratic elections. The belief that the government would turn that prospect to its favor was never understated. As a result, some of the new breed of politicians that had already started organizing themselves into different political groups started influencing the young army officers who were fighting in the battlefronts in order for them to stage a coup and remove the APC from power, as according to them the APC would have rigged the elections, so they decided to use the military to remove the APC from power. As a result, there were several coup plots against the Momo government. Reportedly, there were 3 separate coup plots against the government by the end of 1991. There were certain key military leaders who were also part of the plots to overthrow the government. Although some of them were stationed in Freetown, they knew every stage of the plot's progress. One was being planned at the Tiger Battalion located in the eastern provincial town of Daru. Another one was being planned at the Cobra Battalion located in the eastern provincial town of Kenema, and another was being planned in neighboring Liberia. The group from the Tiger Battalion that was plotting to remove the government involved officers such as Captain Prince Ben Hirsch, Lieutenant Saj Musa, Lieutenant Julius Madabio, Lieutenant Charles Bayo, Lieutenant Komba Kambo, 2nd Lieutenant Kambo Monde, 2nd Lieutenant Idris Kamara, Kindama Kargbo, Victor King, amongst others. This group from the Tiger Battalion that was plotting to overthrow the government was reportedly led by Captain Prince Ben Hirsch, and the group was reportedly sponsored by a civilian who was the elder brother of Captain Prince Ben Hirsch, John Benjamin, and few others that included both civilians and senior military officers. Even though Captain Valentin Strasser was at that time deployed in the northern town of Makeni, yet he was still in touch with this group. He was regularly visiting his comrades as a means of staying in touch with their plans. On the other hand, the group from the Cobra Battalion that was plotting to remove the government involved officers such as 2nd Lieutenant Tom Newma and 2nd Lieutenant Saar Sandi, amongst others. The coup plots were carried out in great secrecy. Hence, the different factions started holding secret meetings. The plotters from the Tiger Battalion were holding most of the coordinating meetings in eastern provincial town of Segboma, sponsored by Captain Prince Ben Hirsch's elder brother, John Benjamin, and few others. The plotters from the Tiger Battalion were holding their meeting in the town of Segboma because the reported leader of the group, Captain Prince Ben Hirsch, was a native of the town, and as platoon commander he was assigned with the task of protecting the town. He even initiated an idea of putting young men together whom he personally trained as vigilantes in order to assist the army. Captain Prince Ben Hirsch was unfortunately killed in a very controversial ambush in January of 1992. Some still believe he was killed by enemies within the military. His fellow coup plotters were even more angered by the mysterious death of one of their charismatic comrades. The government's selective arming was to work to the advantage of some of the coup plotters who were brave platoon commanders in the battlefronts. News of their strategies that outwitted the rebels and beat them at their own tactics continued to reach the military leaders and politicians in Freetown. The coup plotters made the case to their military seniors that they could accomplish more if only they had the weapons they needed, but the military establishment was suspicious and did not want to trust them with more sophisticated weapons. However, some of the coup plotters capitalized on their popularity and bravery at the war front to bypass the military structure that would not arm the fighting men. They did so by going through the political leadership at the State House in Freetown, which is the office of the president. From that point, some of them started receiving robust military support that came not from military headquarters but from the State House in Freetown. Over the many months leading to the coup, some of them would head to the State House every other week to pick up weapons and food for their fighting unit. With more lethal weapons, the soldiers achieved spectacular successes against the rebels. With their continued success came more military weapons, and with their appeal, the soldiers ended up getting one of the prized weapons in the Sierra Leone arsenal at the time, a mobile anti-aircraft gun. There were only two in the nation's arsenal, and both were based in Freetown before one was sent to the war zone. By allowing the plotters to visit the State House in Freetown, the military and political leadership unknowingly played into the hands of the coup plotters, who eventually took notice of the stockpile weapons at the State House. And they realized that the State House had more weapons in stock than any military location fighting the war, or all the military barracks in Freetown combined at that time. The military and political leadership were keeping the sophisticated weapons at the State House as a means of protecting the government. Should in case a coup attempt occur, loyal troops to the government would have used the sophisticated weapons at the State House to crush such attempt because the State House had more weapons in stock than any military location fighting the war or all the military barracks in Freetown combined at that time. Hence, the coup plotters therefore decided that on the day of the coup, they should attack and occupy the State House as a means of forestalling any counterattacks from any troops that would be more armed. Before executing the coup, the plotters from the Tiger Battalion and the plotters from the Cobra Battalion had come together and merged into a single force. Together, they had the backing and support of key civilian figures like John Benjamin and some key military figures, some of whom were even commanders in the battlefronts. The plotters agreed on April 29, 1992, as the day for the operation. Before executing the coup, the plotters did prior work. That is, many months before the coup, they had undertaken reconnaissance missions by traveling through secondary roads that would take them from their battlefronts to Freetown and back again without using the main roads. At the time of the coup, the Tiger Battalion was still under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Obiz Yamba Toure, and the Cobra Battalion was under the command of a newly appointed commander, Major Samuel Kanu, who replaced Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu as commander of the Cobra Battalion. The circumstances that led to the April 29, 1992 coup started a day before, on April 28, when platoon commanders Lieutenant Saj Musa from the Tiger Battalion, 2nd Lieutenant Sahar Sandi from the Cobra Battalion, and 2nd Lieutenant Tom Niuma, also from the Cobra Battalion, along with some junior personnel, smuggled and commandeered the only anti-aircraft gun from the battlefront and embarked on a journey from the battlefront to Freetown to topple the government. The officers and their men did not travel to Freetown with an overwhelming force that could topple the government. Lieutenant Julius Maada Bio was tasked to immediately reinforce the troop in case Lieutenant Saj Musa, Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi and Second Lieutenant Tom Nyuma and their fighting men failed, since the plotters had already undertaken reconnaissance missions by traveling through secondary roads that would take them from the war zones to Freetown and back again without using the main roads. They therefore decided to use secondary roads when available. On their way to Freetown before approaching secondary roads, the vehicle carrying the anti-aircraft gun developed some mechanical problems. As a result, they had to stop to fix the problems. While fixing the problems, they were bumped into by the newly appointed Cobra Battalion commander, Major Samuel Kanu, who strongly demanded to know where and what they were doing with the anti-aircraft gun. Realizing Major Samuel Kanu's determination to arrest them, Lieutenant Saj Musa, Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi and Second Lieutenant Tom Nyuma seized the opportunity and ordered the arrest of Major Samuel Kanu, and this was done. He was handcuffed and thrown into the truck to which the anti-aircraft gun had been mounted. With that done, the plotters started the dangerous trip to Freetown, since moving an anti-aircraft gun to the capital would have been suspicion because there were military checkpoints. They therefore avoided major roads by using secondary ones, when available. Just after they took off and realizing that there was no turning back, Lieutenant Saj Musa and his fellow coup plotters explained to Major Samuel Kanu that they were heading to Freetown to overthrow the APC government. The plotters told their commander that they knew their commander would not approve of their action, and that was why they had him arrested and thrown into the truck. In case they were busted, they told him they would be the first to tell anyone that the commander had absolutely nothing to do with their coup plan, hence the reason he was arrested and, against his will, thrown into the truck and brought along. The bodyguards of Major Samuel Kanu, who escaped after his arrest, informed the battalion headquarters and the brigade headquarters what had happened. The brigade commander, Colonel Jusu Sano Goto, immediately informed the military headquarters in Freetown what was unfolding, and some officers were tasked to go into ambush, which they did, but none of them were courageous and manned enough to stand on the way, or even fire a single shot when the coup plotters approached their ambush zones. As stated earlier, the force commander, Major General Mohammed Sheku Tarawali, was in Europe to purchase arms and ammunition, and this gave the coup plotters the upper hand. Because the deputy force commander, Brigadier Thoronka, who was acting as force commander, failed to manage situation properly, and this gave the mutineers the upper hands. The trip along the secondary roads from the war front to Freetown was not menacing, and they evaded any overt suspicion. A missing anti-aircraft gun was a matter of the gravest concern to the military and political leadership in Freetown and in Daru, the home of the Tiger Battalion, and the failure to communicate with the newly appointed commanding officer of the Cobra Battalion, Major Samuel Kanu, to provide instant feedback about the whereabouts of this weapon was even more troubling. The commander of the Tiger Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Obiz Yambatur, was in Freetown trying to get additional logistics for a pending operations. This made it more worrisome for the government since they could not get hold of the newly appointed Cobra Battalion commander, Major Samuel Kanu. The military signals unit at the Wilberforce Barracks in Freetown, the main and largest military barracks in the country, had tried repeatedly on April 28th to contact Major Samuel Kanu, the commanding officer of the Cobra Battalion, but to no avail. The military signals had also been informed that the anti-aircraft gun was missing, and with it some young officers from their positions. The government then informed the Inspector General of Police, James Bambe Kamara, about the situation. James Bambe Kamara was ordered to dispatch a counter-coup unit to forestall any attempt of a coup. This unit did not come from the military, but from the police's Special Security Division, SSD, under James Bambe Kamara's command. By this time, the coupists were close to Freetown, and the men were not intercepted by the counter-coup unit that night. They arrived in the environs of Freetown around 5 a.m. on April 29th. Once in Freetown, they occupied the State House, which is the office of the president, thereby preventing Momo and other State House officials from going to work. The moves the soldiers made when they arrived in Freetown were the most strategic of all. They had led some of their men to the State House and occupied it. Since ICOMOG forces were already stationed in Sierra Leone since the start of the Liberian Civil War, using Lungi Airport as a backup base, the soldiers therefore led another group of their men to the ICOMOG and informed the unit commander that ICOMOG should not interfere into what was happening in the country because it was an internal matter. But it was the move for State House that guaranteed the success of the coup. The State House was the most heavily armed fortress in Sierra Leone at the time, and had been that way for some time since the rebel war began. The State House had more weapons in stock than any military location fighting the war, or all the military barracks in Freetown combined at that time. The Coupists knew about the State House arsenal. In fact, they had seen the stockpile when they would, as I have stated earlier, come to pick up supplies authorized by President Momo. Thus, their sole aim the moment they arrived in Freetown that morning was to take possession of that arsenal. And once they did, they knew that there was no way President Momo was going to fight back. In fact, it was only after they were sure that they had taken over State House and were in control of the stockpile that they ordered the anti-aircraft gun to be fired. Thus, the success of the coup. When news reached the authorities that there were certain disgruntled soldiers that had occupied the State House, which is the office of the president, the mutineers then claimed that they were in Freetown to protest over the shortage of rations and non-payment of their salaries, which had been in arrears for a long time. But in reality, they only used this as a pretext for entering the capital. Their real motive, as it turned out, was to overthrow the government of President Momo and assume political power. The government then attempted to fight back by assembling at the Wilberforce barracks in Freetown a large number of loyal soldiers with the task of going to the State House and flush out the mutineers and crush the coup. However, such missions did not happen because the mutineers were not going to take any chances, and by then the coup had taken a firm foothold. After the mutineers released 3 to 4 shots into the air from the mounted twin barrels anti-aircraft support weapon at the State House, there was no courageous Freetown-based military or police personnel to go near the State House to counter or attempt to remove mutineers. In fact, some of them later ended up joining the mutineers. The few frontline personnel who were in Freetown on official errands, who were also asked to remove the mutineers from the State House, also later ended up joining them. The Tiger Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Obiz Yamba Toure was in Freetown trying to get additional logistics for our pending operations. Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu, who was commander of the Cobra Battalion before being replaced by Major Samuel B. Kanu, was also in Freetown awaiting to be posted to Liberia on Ecomog duty. Since both men were in Freetown and the government was thinking that these two men would be able to persuade their platoon commanders to go back to the battlefront when they claimed they were in Freetown to demand for better conditions for the frontline personnel. As a result, the government decided to use both men together with other senior officers in Freetown to negotiate with the mutineers when they claimed they were in Freetown to demand for better conditions for the frontline personnel. But the mutineers refused to negotiate. Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu urged them that as soldiers, their loyalty was to the government of the day and that they could not change the government by force of arms. He tried to convince the mutineers to renounce the coup in exchange for a pardon, but they refused to negotiate. Their negotiations continued up to about noon, when there was mention of food. The mutineers had hardly eaten since they left battlefront. They were invited to cross over at a nearby hotel, the Paramount Hotel, where lunch had been ordered. The hotel was just opposite the State House. The mutineers, hungry and exhausted, thought it a reasonable offer, but they were soon tipped that the invitation was a trap. Information had reached them that armed plainclothes soldiers or police officers had been seen entering the hotel from the back. The lunch invitation, therefore, was to lure them into the hotel, and once in there, they would be confronted by these plainclothes officers, disarmed and arrested. This information resulted in some of the most intense barrage of gunfire that day. Lieutenant Saj Musa ordered that any soldier who attempted to cross over to the hotel would have his head blown off. The mutineers then fired at the hotel and demanded occupants to leave immediately. They took it over. At one point, the mutineers wanted to make Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu their leader, as both 2nd Lieutenant Tom Numa and 2nd Lieutenant Sar Sandi were from the Cobra Battalion, where he, Lieutenant Colonel James Yaya Kanu, was the battalion commander before being replaced by Major Samuel Kanu. In fact, initially reports stated that he was the leader of the coup, and as a result, he was interviewed on the BBC Focus on Africa on the same day. During the interview, he denied being the leader of the coup. He in fact denied being part of the mutineers, stating instead that he was attempting to negotiate with the mutineers. In fact, he even refused to acknowledge that the revolt was a coup by his men. His interview indicated to the coup plotters that he was a loyalist of President Momo, and thus he was arrested shortly afterwards and detained only to be executed together with a bunch of others, including the Inspector General of Police James Bambe Kamara, about 8 months later after being dubiously accused of planning a coup while they were in prison. Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi was killed on the very day of the coup allegedly by Lieutenant Colonel Sim Toure, the head of Sierra Leone military intelligence and a close ally of the deposed president. After Lieutenant Sahar Sandi was killed, a heavily armed military manhunt took place across Sierra Leone to find Lieutenant Colonel Sim Toure and others suspected to have participated in the assassination, forcing Lieutenant Colonel Sim Toure to flee to neighboring Guinea and later to the United Kingdom. Dozens of soldiers loyal to President Momo were arrested. Lieutenant Colonel Sim Toure later denied the claims that he killed Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi. He stated that Second Lieutenant Sar Sandi was killed in a crossfire. At about noon, Sierra Leoneans, minus the mutineers, were still unsure of what was happening except for the brief information from President Momo's interview heard over the BBC that disgruntled soldiers had decided to disturb the peace in Freetown. Later that afternoon, the coup mutineers managed to make their way to the Wilberforce Barracks in Freetown, the largest military barracks in the country and the main barracks of the Sierra Leone military. When the disgruntled general public noticed that it was a coup attempt against the Momo's APC government, they took to the streets in support of the rebellion. The jobless youths and students joined in, and the coup became very popular. President Momo and the then Nigerian head of state, General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida, were officer cadet mates during their military training days in Nigeria in the early 1960s. General Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida had even visited Momo in Freetown in the 1980s, and even went as far as Momo's hometown when both men were now heads of state of their respective countries. Because of their friendship, President Momo allowed Sierra Leone to serve as the Nigerian-led ECOMOG operational base for the ECOMOG operation in neighboring Liberia, because his friend Ibrahim Badamasi Babangida wanted it. Since there was already a Nigerian ECOMOG reserve battalion stationed in Sierra Leone at the time, President Momo therefore asked the adequately armed Nigerian Reserve Battalion commander to help reverse the coup, who in turn told President Momo that since he had no instructions from Nigeria, he would not interfere with what he saw as an internal affair, and that was not included in his mandate. He told Momo he could not commit troops without direct orders from the Nigerian government. However, he accepted to take President Momo under his protection in order to prevent a potential conflict or even an assault on his location. President Momo was advised to relocate to Guinea. As a result, he decided to take refuge in Guinea as President Lansana Conté's guest, and that is how President Momo was overthrown. As stated earlier, the initial reason the coup plotters gave for entering the capital was to demand the payment of their salaries, which had been in arrears for a long time. But in reality, they only used this as a pretext for entering the capital. Their real motive, as it turned out, was to overthrow the government of President Momo and assume political power. Within moments, the Momo government capitulated. This happened so quickly because there were no institutions or mechanism in place to resist such tremor. Some senior military officers were rounded up and taken to the central prison in Freetown, including the Inspector General of Police. James Bambe Kamara. Ministers of Momo's government were arrested, including some members of parliament. However, some ministers and members of parliament managed to escape. The young soldiers formed themselves into a junta, which they named the National Provisional Ruling Council, NPRC, composed of young military officers all below the age of 30. This was to be the government of Sierra Leone for the next 4 years. Captain Valentine Strasser, being the most senior, as the sole captain in the group, was made chairman and leader of the NPRC, and he became the youngest head of state in the world at just 25 years old. He became the world's youngest leader just 3 days after his 25th birthday. Sierra Leoneans in general, and the youths in particular, welcomed the coup plotters and gave them their full support in the belief that the new military regime would introduce positive changes after several years of decadence and failed leadership. Besides, the coup makers were young people to whom the youths hoped to relate well. The NPRC coup has been described as a real revolution. However, some people viewed the NPRC coup as a regionally motivated coup because most of the coup leaders were from the eastern and southern parts of the country against the APC government that has its strongholds in the northern and western parts of the country. The coup has been widely seen and regarded as a pro-SLPP coup because it was widely supported and celebrated by members and supporters of the SLPP, the main opposition party that had been outlawed in 1978 upon the declaration of a one-party state, and the majority of the coup plotters were were from the eastern and southern parts of the country, the SLPP strongholds, with few exceptions such as Captain Valentine Strasser, who was from the western part of the country, and few others. Additionally, after ruling for 4 years, the NPRC junta later handed over power to the SLPP after the NPRC regime conducted the 1996 Sierra Leonean general election, and the official results of the 1996 Sierra Leonean general election showed that the SLPP won the election. And one of the coup leaders, Julius Maada Bio, would later become president of the country under the SLPP banner after he won the 2018 Sierra Leonean general election.